Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Tonight we're going to be doing a reading from The Case for Israel by Alan Dershowitz, and we'll read Chapter 24, Is Israel's Policy of House Destruction Collective Punishment? The accusation. The Israeli policy of house destruction is collective punishment prohibited by international law. The accusers. The demolition of empty houses by Israeli tanks in the Rafah refugee camp is not much different than the scene of the World Trade Center in which more than 2,500 people were killed, which was destroyed by the terrorists whom we have agreed here to combat and eliminate. The Security Council is practicing double standard in not denouncing Israeli actions while denouncing the perpetrators of September 11th destruction. Statement by the Syrian representative to the Security Council. The reality. Whether it is wise or unwise, the Israeli policy of demolishing houses that were used to facilitate terrorism or owned by people who assisted terrorism is an economic penalty for complicity with murder. It is not particularly effective since the houses are rebuilt with money provided by sympathizers, but so long as it is limited to the houses that are owned by accessories to terrorism, it is not collective punishment. Moreover, the concept of collective accountability of terrorism is widely supported by the vast majority of Palestinians, and their leadership is entirely consistent with law and morality. The proof. Terrorism against innocent civilians is, of course, the ultimate form of collective punishment. Every Israeli, regardless of his or her support for opposition to particular governmental policies, is targeted for death just for being Israelis or Jews. Yet those who support Palestinian terrorism complain most loudly when a home used by a terrorist is destroyed as an economic deterrent against those who are harbor terrorists. Because the impossibility of deterring terrorists themselves, especially suicide bombers, it is important to direct deterrence at those who send them, those who facilitate their actions. It is important to direct deterrence at those who send them, those who facilitate their actions, and those who can have some influence over them. Whether a deterrent is directed against anyone other than the immediate culpable actor, it can be deemed a form of collective punishment. Although collective punishment is prohibited by international law, it is widely practiced through the world, including some of the most democratic and liberal-minded countries. Indeed, no system of international deterrence can be effective without some reliance on collective punishment. Every time one nation retaliates against another, it is collectively punishing citizens of that country. The American and British bombings of German citizens punished the residents of those countries. The atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed thousands of innocent Japanese for their crimes of their leaders. The bombing of military targets inevitably kill civilians. Beyond the killing and wounding of non-capable individuals, there is collective economic punishment, such as UN-approved sanctions and the bankrupting of an enemy nation's economy, which is a common weapon of both hot and cold wars. Nations that wage aggressive war and are defeated often lose territory, and such loss will punish innocent residents of that territory. Many ethnic Germans, some who did not support Hitler, were forced to relocate following Germany's defeat in World War II. Collective punishment is a matter of degree. With the Nazi conflict of Schippenhof, the murder of Kinder townsfolk at one end of the continuum, and the economic consequences of aggression at the other. Calling something collective punishment is often a political or public relations tactic calculated to confuse rather than to clarify. There is much wrong with certain types and degrees of collective punishment, but there is little wrong and often something very right about some kinds of collective accountability for the actions of leaders. For example, it was right in the entire German people to suffer for what their elected leader had unleashed on the world. The few Germans who fought against Hitler should be rewarded, but the vast majority of Germans should have been held accountable for their complicity with evil. In a perfect world, the accountability would have been imposed direct proportion to the personal complicity, with those most directly involved in being imprisoned and those less directly involved being made to suffer economic deprivation. The German people were promised that they would benefit from a Nazi victory, which is part of the reason so many support Hitler. Therefore, it was just for them to suffer from a Nazi defeat, even though some among sufferers were less culpable than others. That is part of what it means to be a nation or a people. Those who start wars and lose them often bring suffering to their people. That is rough justice. It also is a deterrent to unjust wars. Applying this principle to terrorism is not the unjust to cause itself suffer the terrorist actions committed on its behalf, especially if there is widespread support for terrorism within the cause. Consider, for example, a group of extremist anti-abortionists, one of whom's murder abortion doctors, blow abortion clinics, and threaten pregnant women seeking abortions. It would be absurd to reward their terrorism by restricting a woman's right to choose an abortion. It would be justified to set back their cause if they persisted or increased their terrorism, especially if their terrorism were widely supported by rank-and-file members of the group. In this context, recall the 2002 poll described earlier that 87% of Palestinians supported continuing terrorist attacks. Since these supporters hope and expect to benefit collectively from the terrorism, it is just to hold the cause collectively accountable for the murderous acts perpetrated in the name and under its ultimate control. If this benign form of collective accountability can effectively save innocent lives by deterring terrorism, the balance of justice weighs in its favor. The kind of suicide practiced by Palestinians, mass murder of perfectly innocent civilians, with widespread logical, financial, and religious and political emotional support of a large majority of the civilian population, challenges us to rethink the classic bright line distinction between combatants and non-combatants. This line, which lies at the core of the international law of war, has been exploited in the interest of terrorism. Palestinian terrorists have learned to use civilians as both swords and shields. They target Israeli civilians, then hide behind Palestinian civilians when the Israeli military comes after them. They use non-combatants as shields for combatants. They deliberately place their bomb-making factories adjacent to schools, hospitals, and other civilian buildings. The result is that Israel must choose between employing wholesale self-defense tactics such as airstrikes that risk killing a large numbers of non-combatants among whom the combatants are hiding, and employing retail tactics such as house-to-house combat the risks of Israeli soldiers as they did in Jenin. There is no precise formula for calculating the appropriate combatant and non-combatant ratio, even in conventional warfare. A moral nation must be prepared to place some of its own soldiers at risk to prevent the collateral killing of enemy civilians. But it need not risk the lives of many of its own combatants to achieve this solitary aim. The proper moral ratio should depend, at least in part, on the complicity of the non-combatants. If many of them will allow the combatants to hide among them, if they provide support for the combatants, if they make martyrs of the murderers, their own complicity increases, and they move closer to combatant status, of which has become a constant rather than a bright line separating civilians from combatants. An army of liberation whose purpose is rescuing non-consenting citizens from human rights abuses committed against them by their elected leaders should employ a different moral ratio that used by an army against a mixed group of civilians and combatants who mutually support each other in committing crimes against humanity. How far along of the continuum of collective accountability would it be just to order to combat terrorism? Certainly not to the point of deliberately targeting completely innocent people for murder. Indeed, that is precisely what terrorists do. But economic sanctions imposed on the supporters of terrorism are fair and may be effective. Even if some people who do not support terrorism feel economic impact, it seems a small moral price to pay for saving many innocent lives, especially those who support terrorists expect to reap the benefit from the terrorism. Whenever collective economic punishment is imposed on those who support terrorism, I'm always flabbergasted to hear the protestations made in high moral dudgeon by those who support themselves lethal terrorism, such as Yasser Arafat. Equally hypocritical are those academics who support the boycotting of every Jewish Israeli scholar, regardless of their individual views on Israeli policy, then complain about collective punishment of Palestinians who themselves are complicit in terrorism. A boycott of all Israeli scholars and divestments from companies that do business with Israel, of course, acts of collective punishment. The debate over collective punishment of those who are complicit in terrorism reminds me of the Fall River rape case.
in which several categories of morally and illegally complicit individuals: those who actually raped the women, those who held her down, and those who blocked her escape route, those who cheered and encouraged the rapists, and those who could have the police but did not. No rational person would suggest that the people were entirely free of moral guilt, although reasonable people might disagree about the legal guilt of those in the last two categories. The objection to imposing legal responsibility on people in these two categories would be diminished if only one sanction against them was economic, say, fine or civil liability. The accountability of rape is surely a matter of degree, that is, accountability for terrorism of those who cheer the terrorists, make martyrs of them, encourage their own children to become terrorists, and expect to benefit from terrorism. There is nothing morally wrong with holding such complicitors accountable so long as the consequences imposed on them are proportional to their complicity. The U.S.-led economic sanctions are against Iraq, Libya, and Cuba are collective punishments imposed on large populations for the deeds of their leaders. So were the sanctions and boycott imposed against Israel by the Arab League. Israel's policy of demolishing the homes of terrorists, or those who harbor them, is a soft form of collective punishment directed against the property of those who are deemed somewhat complicit. That occasionally has impacted on innocent people detracts from its moral purity, but to a considerably lesser degree than widespread economic sanctions directed against the entire nation. Yet the United Nations has supported such economic sanctions, even as it has condemned Israel's policy of punishing those who assist terrorists. The U.S. policy of confiscating cars, boats, airplanes, and homes used to facilitate the drug trade is also a form of collective accountability designed to deter people from allowing their property to be used by drug smugglers. It may well be a questionable policy, but it has not incurred the kind of condemnation to which Israel has been subjected for taking far less questionable actions to protect a far more serious evil. Israel empties the homes, of course, before bulldozing them, but on a couple occasions people have been killed, including a protester who threw herself in front of a protester and was apparently not seen of its operator. Although she was characterized in media as a peace activist, implying she was a non-partisan supporter of peace, nothing could be farther from the truth. She belonged to a radical pro-Palestinian group of zealots from the extreme left. Others from the extreme racist right wing, who are one-sided supporters of Palestinian terrorists. Members of the International Solidarity Movement are taught to be sensitive to suicide bombers because they are giving their lives for their land and their people. They are directed to consult the Palestinians before they do anything. They serve as human shields, working closely with Palestinian terrorist groups and protecting only Palestinians from Israeli soldiers. They have never offered to serve as shields protecting Israeli civilians against Palestinian terrorism. They do not support peace. Instead, these zealots advocate for a victory of Palestinian terrorism over Israeli self-defense. They receive funds from both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and Ch.24, a senior member of the Islamic Jihad in Jenin, who was involved in planning several of the thwarted suicide bombers arrested by the IDF while hiding in the offices of the International Solidarity Movement in March 2003. And in April 2003, 2 suicide bombers from England hid among the group, even attending a service conducted by it, just days before one of them blew himself up, along with 3 Israelis. The Solidarity group then condemned Israel for its response with murders. The media should stop referring to these people as peace activists and should call them what they are: active supporters and facilitators of Palestinian terrorism. Nevertheless, there's no excuse for the kind of negligence by those responsible for house demolition that resulted in the death of a zealot, but absent physical harm to individuals. The economic sanction of the home destruction is entirely moral if it is limited to those who bear some moral complicity in terrorism that is sought to be deterred. A major problem with destruction of houses involved in terrorism is not with morality. A non-lethal approach like this is among the most moral and calibrated response to terrorism, far more than massive military retaliation, which inevitably produces collateral deaths of non-combatants. The problems with destruction of houses place for related to be. Indeed, some Muslim countries are led to view these houses are destroyed with people still in them. Even when it is clear no one is inside, the inevitable picture of the crying woman bemoaning the loss of her home creates sympathy, even if the same woman was yesterday encouraging her son to become a martyr, and tomorrow will be cheering on the news of an Israeli restaurant being blown up with a dozen teenagers inside. Home destruction is also ineffective because Hamas continues to pay people whose houses are destroyed enough money to build a bigger house. But that treatment payment ended after he was toppled. Under U.S. law, anyone who agrees in advance to pay the family of suicide bombers is a conspirator in terrorism and murder. The international community must come to accept the justice, the appropriate and non-lethal deterrence against those who support benefit from terrorism, rather than threatening meaningless sanctions against the suicide terrorists themselves. This is both fair and potentially effective as a deterrent against many types of terrorism, especially those that rely on suicide bombers. The Associated Press reported on May 21, 2003, that Palestinians whose houses were destroyed by the Israeli military have expressed anger at Palestinian terrorists whom they say invited attack by firing rockets from their own. According to Mohammed Zanin, one of the Palestinian farmers, the terrorists claim they are heroes, but they brought us only destruction and made us homeless. They used our farms, our houses, and our children to hide. As you'll see in Chapter 28, the Israeli Supreme Court recently ruled that only people directed in evolved acts of terrorism may be moved from one part of occupied territories to another. This important decision will surely be cited as a precedent for those arguing that house destruction may be used against people who are complicit in terrorism. In a detailed analysis of Israeli responses to suicide bombings, the New York Times concluded that Israel had achieved considerable success in stemming many attacks, but at a cost. It described one case in which a man named Ali Ajoni had dispatched 2 suicide bombers who killed 5 civilians. The Israeli military blew up Ajori's family home and charged his sister with sewing bomb belts for the attackers and his brother with assisting the murderers. They shot Ali Ajori himself. He was trying to escape. He was a member of the El Aqsa Mothers Brigade, which specializes in suicide bombing. Palestinians, 70 to 80% of whom still support suicide bombing, according to opinion polls cited by New York Times on April 5, 2003, have criticized these tactics, although militants themselves concede the measures have made it harder to stage attacks. The Ajori home, which is largely rebuilt, the lives of the victims cannot be rebuilt. While civil libertarians may disagree about whether the measures taken by Israel are or not excessive, no reasonable person of goodwill can possibly claim they constitute gross violations of human rights or are in any way comparable to acts of terrorism trying to prevent or Nazi tactics, even the tactics being used by the most progressive Arab regimes such as Jordan and Egypt. They are, in fact, comparable measures taken by other democracies such as the United States and Great Britain. Okay, thank you.